We've all seen the images, and they put to the test two fundamental American principles. Excuse me. The first is the right to free speech and for people to peacefully assemble and make their voices heard. The second is the rule of law. Both must be upheld. We are not an authoritarian nation where we silence people or squash dissent. The American people are heard. In fact, peaceful protest is in the best tradition of how Americans respond to consequential issues. But, neither are we a lawless country. We are a civil society, and order must prevail. Throughout our history, we've often faced moments like this because we are a big, diverse, free-thinking, and freedom-loving nation. In moments like this, there are always those who rush in to score political points. But this isn't a moment for politics. It's a moment for clarity. So let me be clear. Peaceful protest in America. Violent protest is not protected. Peaceful protest is. It's against the law when violence occurs. Destroying property is not a peaceful protest. It's against the law. Vandalism, trespassing, breaking windows, shutting down campuses, forcing the cancellation of classes and graduations. None of this is a peaceful protest. Threatening people, intimidating people, instilling fear in people is not a peaceful protest. It's against the law. Dissent is essential to democracy, but dissent must never lead to disorder or to denying the rights of others so students can finish the semester and their college education. Look, it's basically a matter of fairness. It's a matter of what's right. There's the right to protest, but not the right to cause chaos. People have the right to get an education, the right to get a degree, the right to walk across the campus safely without fear of being attacked. But let's be clear about this as well. There should be no place on any campus, no place in America for anti-Semitism or threats of violence against Jewish students. There is no place for hate speech or violence of any kind, whether it's anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, or discrimination against Arab Americans or Palestinian Americans. It's simply wrong. There's no place for racism in America. It's all wrong. It's un-American. I understand people have strong feelings and deep convictions. In America, we respect the right and protect the right for them to express that. But it doesn't mean anything goes. It needs to be done without violence, without destruction, without hate, and within the law. You know, make no mistake, as president, I will always defend free speech, and I will always be just as strong in standing up for the rule of law. That's my responsibility to you, the American people, and my obligation to the Constitution. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, have the protests forced you to reconsider any of the policies with regard to the region?
No. Thank you.
Mr. President, do you think the National Guard should intervene?
No.
Mr. President, do you agree with what the students are calling for?
Mr. President. Well, he seemed to pause there for a moment as if he was going to take some questions, but he just answered the questions that were thrown by the assembled news media with no, asked if the National Guard should intervene in these protests. Pretty sure he said no to that as well. Let's bring in our US correspondent James Matthews, who was listening into that along with us. And James, brief words from President Biden, but perhaps not surprising that peaceful protest is, of course, legal, and he encouraging it. Violent protest is not. He said that Jewish students, any student, should not be intimidated when walking across their campus. How do you think that is going to be received by either side in this divided country?
Well, he hopes it will be received positively, doesn't he, Kamali? At a time of growing crisis and growing disorder, a nation has looked to its president for his answers, and we got it there. Authoritarianism is not the answer, said Biden. Essentially, it's all about democracy. And, you know, he said he wouldn't send in the National Guard, wouldn't endorse that. It's a president talking about American fundamentals, American principles of free speech, stating that they would be protected and should be protected. And yet, his difficulty was, how do you square the circle? How do you have freedom of expression without that becoming a vehicle for hate? And according to the president, it's a matter of fairness. It's a matter of doing what's right, he said. Protest, yes, but do not cause chaos. There should be no place on any campus, he said, for anti-Semitism or hate speech, whoever it discriminates against. It's wrong, he said, and it's not American. The protest, he said, had put to test the two principles, the right to free speech, but also to the rule of law. And he stressed that both must be upheld. But I think fundamental to that was an appeal to the American public at large, specifically to those who have been present and vocal on America's campuses over the past few weeks. We are a civil society, he said. We're not authoritarian, but order, he said, must prevail. Interestingly, we did have the Biden pause at the end of that statement, didn't we? When anything can happen when Joe Biden pauses at the lectern. But interestingly, he was asked by a reporter, will this affect your policy with regard to the Middle East? And he gave an emphatic negative response to that. And, you know, it all plays into the Middle East, Israel, Hamas, and Joe Biden's policy with regard to that. He's a president in need of results when it comes to international diplomacy in the Middle East. And increasingly, as we see from these scenes on our screen right now, he faces concerns amongst Americans about America's interaction with the Israel-Hamas conflict. It is a growing difficulty for President Biden, and one that he clearly has to address and felt he had to make a public statement about today. But essentially, you know, central to the message was we are a free country. Freedom of expression should exist on campus, but it can't continue without respect for the rule of law and due regard and respect for fellow students and the population across America's university estate.
Yeah, and James, I suppose the position that Biden finds himself in, you know, he's got his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, out in the region every couple of days to try and bring about the ceasefire. And you can tell us, James, it seems to me as if the language that President Biden has used over the past few weeks and months about what's happening in Gaza towards the current Israeli government is some of the harshest and strongest language we've heard from an American administration about Israel's actions in that region. And yet we're still seeing that those protesters, those pro-Palestinian protesters, are not happy with what they're hearing from the White House.
Yeah, and that's Biden's difficulty, isn't it? You know, what do you say to Israel? What do you say? What actions do you implement to square the circle in the Middle East, to solve the problem, an intractable problem? And even today, Hamas have let it be known, still to be confirmed, but have let it be known that they're not happy with the ceasefire hostage release deal that's on the table. So optimism is increasingly thin on the ground with regard to a ceasefire deal and progress with regard to negotiations towards some kind of settlement. And, you know, it's a question for Joe Biden. What do you do next? When does a verbal warning not constitute enough in terms of shifting positions, shifting entrenched positions in the Middle East to the benefit of all, particularly those who are suffering most in the Middle East, but politically to the benefit of Joe Biden? The longer the crisis continues, then clearly the longer or the more gravely it will rebound on Joe Biden with a view to November's election, his political situation domestically. We had Donald Trump going into his criminal court case in New York talking about these campus protests, talking about how he reckoned they were driven by radical left loonies and how they would not be allowed to take over the country. So clearly, Donald Trump is styling this as an element in his election campaigning. And there's no doubt the longer it goes on, the more it becomes an issue for them both. And it becomes an issue in terms of election campaigning because it's an extremely untidy scene in Joe Biden's own backyard, a president who wants to be seen to be in control. But, you know, the evidence of our TV screens confounds that on a daily basis. That's certainly the case at the moment, and it will worry him politically.
And finally then, James, just look ahead for us. You know, it's the beginning of May now. We've got the whole summer ahead. We've got conventions coming up, and then, of course, we've got that vote as well. This protest on UCLA is over. There's one happening in Berkeley, in California. There are others around the country. It's probably not the end of this, is it? So what are the administration feeling the rest of the summer is going to be like? What's the sense there as to what could be coming?
Their fear, clearly, is that it develops and it continues to grow into a Vietnam War-style situation. I was at Columbia University yesterday, 56 years to the day since there was a seizing of Hamilton Hall, one of their main academic buildings there. The previous time, in 1968, that was by anti-Vietnam War protesters. That had a huge political impact on America at large at the time. It certainly damaged the sitting president, Nixon, at that moment. So Biden will be acutely aware of the dangers of domestic political revolt. He will be aware of the extent to which that could weaken him. The hope will be that the message he has just delivered will resonate, and the appeal for freedom of speech, the appeal to respect the rule of law and fellow students, whoever they may be. In terms of logistics and practicalities, the end of term can't come soon enough for Joe Biden. We're not far from finals and the breakup for the summer, so that may work, I suppose, to his benefit, the population drifting away from campuses, and but it has to come to an end, these scenes of disorder and this growing dissent on America's campuses. That has to come to an end for Joe Biden, because the longer it goes on, the more damaging it is for him.
Okay, James Matthews in DC, appreciate that. Thank you for now.